I hear the sound of distant crying, the darkness multiplying, and weary hearts deny. All I feel is my heartbeat, beating like a drum, beating with confusion. All I hear are the voices telling me to go, but I could never run, 'cause in my African dream
If you had no profession or trade back in the old country, you existed in a very biblical fashion by the sweat of your brow. You could chop wood, haul heavy burdens like a human pack horse, dig ditches, carry water, till fields. But what to do here at the southern tip of Africa, where there was a plentiful supply of cheap, very cheap labor from the native inhabitants of this dusty land? Remembering the energy and tumult of the shtetl marketplace, and with the aid of a small loan from an old neighbor or a relative, you buy a few necessities that people living some distance from the city would really want. Everybody needs something, right? And you roll them into some kind of portable pack, and after hasty consultation with people who've been in that direction about which track leads where, you hoist the pack on your shoulders and begin to walk. Oi. While our first few peddlers were setting off on their lonely journeys into the farmland of the Western Cape, certain new arrivals in the colony were instituting bigger trade ventures all the way to the Eastern Cape.
That was the area where the British 1820 settlers had chosen sheep farming as one of their major attempts to establish themselves as the bulwark against the troubles of the northeastern border with the Xhosa tribes. Two Jewish brothers hailing from Germany, Adolf and Joseph Musenthal, set themselves up as traders working out of the settlement of Algoa Bay. They were the exact incarnation of the businessmen traders that were the mainstay of the major commercial centers of Europe. Their business was what we today know as import-export, importing goods for sale in the Cape Colony, such as cloth, tools, ironware, pots and pans, clay pipes, glassware, and even cheese and gin, and exporting from South African shores the largely agricultural products emerging from farms of the area, such as hides and skins. But it was in the wool industry that the brothers found their métier, establishing a network that transferred the raw wool from the local sheep farms to the mills and looms of England's North Country. It helped that the brothers had their own sheep farm, but they served as middlemen and traders for the emergent industry. Another set of brothers, Aaron and Elias de Pas, based themselves in Cape Town with a wide range of business interests, including shipping, ship repair, and agriculturally valuable guano. And who was their partner in the guano business but our indefatigable jack of all trades, Benjamin Norden. After setting up Cape Town's first ice-making factory, they were at the forefront of a new method of preparing food products for transfer to the UK and Europe, what was to become the multi-million-dollar cold storage industry. As leading lights of the emergent Cape Town Jewish community, they were intimately involved in its welfare. And Aaron de Pas himself personally brought the first Torah scroll from London to Benjamin Norden's Tikvat Israel Synagogue in Cape Town's Company Gardens.
But let's return to our lonely peddler, traveling from farm to farm in the interior. The Smos of Africa has accrued a lot of romance and mythology about his person. There's still argument about the derivation of the word itself. Some say it derives from the Dutch pronunciation of Mausis. Others say it's from the German word schmus, meaning to talk or haggle, and the same word from which the Yiddish schmooze derives. Initially, their basic level trading was one-sided, but with many farmers eking out a hard-scrabble subsistence existence, bartering soon entered the picture. The samosa began to return to Cape Town or Graafrenet with farm produce or hides and skins, and even livestock ready to be sold on in the town markets. Slowly, the Smos graduated from his lonely trudge with a pack of goods on his back to small donkey carts able to transport a bigger range, and later fully equipped wagons that declared their rise in status and economic success.
The lonely Smos wasn't always so lonely, and sometimes, given the circumstances, married the daughters of country farmers, in a conflation of any number of Jewish jokes and the old one about the farmer's daughter. But this was the start of another distinct type that was so much part of the South African Jewish history, the Boerejood, the farmer Jew. Nowadays, the term refers more to the Afrikaans-speaking Jews rather than actual farmers.
Boerejood is ek het in 'n Afrikaanse huis groot geraak en in 'n Afrikaanse agterkoms so. Bediende het my basies groot maak, my pa het my net Afrikaans geleer so. So ons praat hier reg Engels of Hebreë nie, is maar gemengelmoes van Afrikaans en alles die mekaar is so dis waar Boerejood vanaf kom ja.
Those few who had married into a local family were bound to settle in the area, usually in the nearest village, since these Smosa weren't always the kind to go farming, though some did. But they needed a livelihood, and the logical transition from being an itinerant peddler was to set up a small general goods store to serve the villagers and farmers. The country store, die Algemene Handelaar, became so much a fixture of rural South Africa that its origins have been largely forgotten. But if you want to draw a line all the way to the huge Jewish corporations of today in the country, this is where they essentially began. The country stores most often became the center of village or small town life. Not only was it the place where you bought your necessities, and since these rural villages and towns were a good few days' journey from Cape Town or Port Elizabeth, they stocked everything. But it also served as the local post depot, the pharmacy supplementing the old farm remedies, the village meeting spot apart from the local church hall, the local gossip exchange, the informal town hall, and the further the village was from 19th century civilization, the more these stores often had a tavern attached for both thirsty farmers and travelers.
Because the stores were essential to these remote farming communities and played such a central role in the community, the Jews were often accepted as much respected members. In addition, because so many of these rural communities were deeply religious and adhered to the Calvinist Reformed doctrine, there was a respect for the people of the book. Quite often, a century later, when the grey shirts and other promoters of rabid anti-Semitism tried to turn the farmers and village folk against their local Jewish community, there were instances when the bigots were run out of town with dire warnings not to mess with our bloody Jews. Not all immigrant Jews hankered for a remote and rural existence. Many preferred the larger towns and the bustle of a more robust marketplace. In addition, in a sizable town, it was much easier to integrate into the general population and not stand out as the immigrant foreigner. And there was always the supportive Jewish community into which they could always retreat.
The larger variety of choice on offer to the townsfolk also meant a degree of specialization would be helpful, and many Jewish traders became shopkeepers appealing to specific markets. These towns would boast grocers, haberdashers, drapers, mechanics, cobblers, wine merchants, printers and gazetteers, and Uncle Tom Goldstein and all. Not all of these emporia were in Jewish hands, but many Jewish families would enter into happy rivalry with their neighbors, and the entire family would take turns in manning the counter.
I've mentioned before that certain fields in South Africa, if not controlled solely by Jews, certainly had a dominant Jewish presence. The wool industry was one, as well as the trade in ivory. More would come at later points in the history of the community, such as I.W. Schlesinger's dominance in the citrus orchards of Zebedelia, Jacob Ben-Luri's Potato Mountain, and Israel Lazarus at the forefront of maize. However, towards the end of the 19th century, a matter of fashion helped propel the Jewish community up the social scale and into the forefront of an extremely lucrative business in one particular town.
Intensive farming interests and its proximity to the ports of the Eastern Cape would have ensured a steady growth for Oudtshoorn, but it was the sudden mania for the decorative luxuriance of the ostrich feather that made the town almost explode in size in a very short space of time. So many Jewish immigrants took up residence and found employment in the ostrich feather industry in Oudtshoorn that the town was referred to as the Jerusalem of the South. Not only were the feathers traded and exported by the enterprising members of the community, but large flocks were raised and improved through selective breeding.
The more artfully the couturiers and milliners of the late 19th and early 20th centuries used the feathers, the more desirable they became. At one point, ounce for ounce, ostrich feathers could fetch the same price as gold.
You know, the sums of money involved with these feathers was extraordinary. One consignment on one day, £623, 8 shillings and 4pence. That's a lot of money.
At the forefront was Max Rose, first among the many feather barons. So expert was he in all aspects of raising and breeding of ostriches and their byproducts that when the crash came, and all booms are followed by a crash, he was appointed by the colonial legislature to head up a government commission to investigate the problems in the feather industry.
Why did so lucrative an industry come to so sudden an end? Fashion and tastes again, I suppose, because the world was a very different place after the First World War. There was no longer space for the excesses of the fin de siècle and the Edwardian era. Clothing was simpler and skimpier, and there were other ways of displaying one's husband's wealth. But talking of wealth, what did the nouveau riche of Oudtshoorn do with their fortunes? There was a rash of building projects that included new Jewish schools and synagogues. The St. John's Road Synagogue included this replica of the Aron Kodesh from the Lithuanian town of Kelm, ancestral home to many of the immigrants. And many of the feather barons built lavish homesteads for their families, known as feather palaces, where they entertained on an equally lavish scale. Some toured for pleasure and returned from Europe with their wives modeling the latest Paris fashions that excited the women of Oudtshoorn into frenzied envy and motivated their seamstresses into industrious reproduction. Ostrich farms still exist in Oudtshoorn, partly as a tourist destination, but mainly to provide skins for the leather industry and no cholesterol meat. Unfortunately, since ostrich meat isn't kosher, the last links with the ostrich boom in Oudtshoorn have almost been severed. It's sterling silver and is a scale model of the impressively named Griqualand West Hebrew Congregation Synagogue, which was officially opened and consecrated in 1902. It's quite an expensive token of esteem, isn't it? Well, that's what it is. Gustav Henry Bonas was president of the congregation in 1902 and had been the driving force behind the construction of this new shul to replace the old wood and corrugated iron structure that had served the Jewish community of Kimberley for about 2 decades. Because of his deep involvement in bringing a new shul into being and in grateful thanks, the congregation presented him with a scale model of the shul in sterling silver. We don't know what happened to the model immediately after presentation, but it later disappeared, both from memory and its last known location. Time passed, and an old congregant happened to be in London and saw the model in a pawn shop. He purchased it for the shul, schlepped it back to South Africa, and it eventually stood in this glass case at the entrance. A botched burglary found the model abandoned on the lawn, probably because of its excessive weight, and it now has its home at the South African Jewish Museum in Cape Town. The Kimberley Synagogue has another treasure, a yad, the traditional hand-shaped pointer used in reading from the Torah. That one has a perfect, brilliant blue-white diamond mounted on its forefinger, and it's kept in a safety deposit box at a bank because of its value.
That diamond may be kept out of sight, but it was the sudden discovery of a diamond on the banks of the Orange River in daylight that takes our story into the next chapter.
The pebble picked up in 1867 by a farm boy, later identified as a diamond and known as the Eureka Diamond, was the start of the Cape Colony's diamond rush. Hopetown was the nearest trading center to the farm where the stone was found, as well as another farm where the next big find produced the very much larger Star of Africa. In Hopetown, the major trading store was a branch of the Mosenthal Empire and was run by the Lilienfeld brothers, who had emigrated from Marburg in Germany and were the purchasers of the stone.
The Lilienfelds were nephews of the Mosenthals, those indefatigable Jewish traders who dominated commerce across the eastern Cape Colony, and they took over their uncle's interests when the Mosenthals sold up and eventually returned to Germany. As Hopetown was directly on the major route to the area that was then being developed as the Diamond Fields of Griqualand West, it was almost inevitable that the Lilienfelds would become traders in uncut stones. They were shareholders in the Hopetown Diamond Company, which was eventually absorbed into De Beers by the turn of the century.
De Beers, the name most synonymous with diamonds, not only in South Africa, but all over the world.
Cecil John Rhodes's obsession with controlling all the mineral wealth of southern Africa for the British Empire, and his own benefit, of course, was instrumental in forming this first giant conglomerate of South African mining, and the Jewish members of its directorate are legendary. Let's start with David Harris, later Sir David Harris, prospector, soldier, businessman, and by most accounts, an all-round mensch. He's the man who ends up as one of the longest-serving chairmen of De Beers. But he never forgot his background in Spitalfields in the East End of London, and he remained one of the most influential and involved members of the Griqualand West Hebrew congregation. Throughout his political career, Harris always protected the Jewish community whenever they were threatened or inconvenienced. Harris first came to the Cape Colony in 1871, landing unusually in Durban on the East Coast. As a frugal East Ender with not much in the way of cash in his pocket, he literally walked the new center of diamond digging mania, Kimberley, alongside an ox cart carrying his possessions. His first attempts at diamond prospecting and dealing were abysmal, and it was only a spot of luck at a gambling table that brought him enough money to return to London for a family visit. But his stories of his life in the diamond fields fired up his cousin, who decided to follow him back to South Africa.
That cousin was one Barnett Isaacs, a streetwise Cockney barrow boy who had chanced his hand at a variety of things to earn a living, including a stint in London's music halls and as a professional boxer. In fact, along with changing his name, one of the first things he did was set up this boxing academy in Kimberley. Presumably, the Wild West atmosphere of the diggings needed a degree of advantageous skill in the brawls that frequently broke out between prospectors. The name change lasted a lot longer than the boxing academy. We know the lad today as Barney Bonato, one of the most colorful of colorful characters to emerge from the diamond and gold era of the South African Jewish community history. Barney and his brother Harry initially attempted to make a living by presenting their music hall act in the diamond fields. It did not go down all that well, and Barney drifted into diamond dealing and the real start of his rise, buying up supposedly worked-out claims. By amalgamating these, he soon controlled almost as many digs and mines as Rhodes and his partners, posing a challenge to their control of the diamond mining industry. So, Rhodes's response was to make Bonato part of the De Beers empire, amalgamating their holdings. The rest, as people say, is history. It seems that Barney was the originator of pegging diamond availability to market demand with the controlled release of a limited number of stones, something that is standard practice worldwide today.
And meanwhile, cousin David Harris was quietly and steadily in the background doing similar work, but without the flamboyant flourishes that typified Bonato, and would eventually become a long-serving chairman of De Beers. When cousin Barney went off to the Witwatersrand to consolidate his gold interests, Harris forged a career as a volunteer soldier and then later as a parliamentarian, representing, of course, the constituency of Griqualand West. Other significant Jewish individuals crop up with great regularity during the era of the development of the diamond fields. Alfred Byte, Isaac Lewis, and Sammy Marks. Though the firm of Lewis and Marks was one of the most important in Kimberley, all three would really come into their own later when they shifted their attention to the soon-to-be-developed gold fields of the Witwatersrand.
The sparkle of diamonds and their allure to new immigrants never really abated. The sheer quantity of new prospectors working claims eventually resulted in the topographical phenomenon of a significant portion of the diamond fields, once the Kimberley Pipe had been mapped, becoming what is referred to these days as the Big Hole of Kimberley. A good proportion of those prospectors were Jewish, including my grandfather. The increasing international awareness of the mineral riches of southern Africa meant that immigrants from a wide variety of backgrounds began to head south. Gold was discovered in the northeastern Transvaal area in 1873 in sufficient quantities to precipitate a gold rush. However, it was the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand area in 1886, coinciding with the start of the Litvak immigration, that inspired significant numbers of these immigrants to head for the South African Republic of the Transvaal as a destination of choice. Ferreira's camp was the settlement which later grew into a new city, Johannesburg. The city of Johannesburg is one of the few where Jewish immigrants could claim to be co-founders and pioneers of a new metropolis right from the start. Recognition came as Jews were founders or part of the various mining companies that eventually coalesced to exploit the huge reef that summoned Johannesburg into being. Most of the new wave of Jewish immigration never found their way into these rapidly expanding mining companies, but they were still part of the founding of the city in that they took on the roles of tradesmen, shopkeepers, and manufacturers that changed a mining camp into a town and a town into a city. It wasn't always plain sailing, particularly since there were so many vested interests on the part of national and international players. Many of the prejudices of the old countries were imported alongside speculation and ingenuity and colonial aspirations. Yet somehow, these Jewish immigrants felt that they were on firmer, more egalitarian ground, with perhaps more opportunities than the old world.
The big names of Kimberley diamond mining were the ones who had the money to exploit the goldfields, particularly since it would emerge that though the reef was rich, it was deep, and it needed new techniques. In this way, flush with their success in Kimberley, come Sammy Marks and his cousin Isaac Lewis. Born the son of a poor tailor in Lithuania, Marks spent some time in Sheffield in England before deciding to try his luck on the Kimberley diamond fields. For his expedition to South Africa, Marks acquired some goods he could sell on, including a canteen of Sheffield cutlery. And, once joined by his cousin, the two set out to sell goods, utensils, and implements to diamond prospectors. Yes, this major industrialist begins his career as a smose. Sammy and Isaac set up shop as traders once they had begun to make their money, with a fixed address, and since they were so often paid by prospectors in diamonds, the next step was to become two of the most important diamond traders in Kimberley. This was the first fortune that allowed them to journey north into the Transvaal once news of the Barberton and Pilgrim's Rest gold strike began to circulate. Investments in those mines paid off, enough for Lewis and Marks to realize that their strength lay in servicing the mining industry rather than investing in it. However, there was one area of mining that Marks invested in heavily: coal mining, since he realized the necessity of fuel for his future enterprises. It was also with an eye on the miners' market that he opened his first factory, a distillery, and a little later a brickworks. Marks expanded into farming, then into canning, and needing the containers for his preserved produce, set up a glassworks as well. Yet it was his formative years in Sheffield that spurred him on to the eventual creation of the Union Steelworks. But that was very much later, after the Boer War and the formation of the Union of South Africa from the 4 separate colonies. Marx's association with President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal Republic is legendary. As far back as his time in Kimberley, he realized that the only way of developing new industry in the Transvaal would be with government backing, and he journeyed to meet Kruger and gain his trust. How much was calculation on Marx's part and how much was genuine respect and friendship is something that is open to speculation. but in a comparatively short space of time, Marx became Kruger's confidant and advisor. Yet here was this Litvak, who had been polished to a semblance of one of the English Jewish aristocracy, walking a careful line between his Boer sympathies and his English sensibilities. In time, he would live out his life paradoxically as an English gentleman in a manor house just outside of Pretoria, but he managed to retain Kruger's ear and continued to advise him. That from time to time his advice would have benefits for his personal empire is to be expected. After all, Sammy Marx was first and foremost a businessman seeking to turn a profit. But it did have the unfortunate side effect of reinforcing some negative stereotypical perceptions on the part of certain Afrikaner nationalists. However, the many stories of his relationship with the cantankerous president show the regard and affection with which he was held. Perhaps most famous is the one regarding Marx's complaint to Oom Paul after he had petitioned him for ground on which to build a synagogue. "You only gave us half of what you give the churches," accused Marx. "That's because you Jews only believe in half of the Bible," was Paul Kruger's response. When it came to the Anglo-Boer War, Sammy Marx was in an invidious position. His sympathies initially lay with the Boer Republic, but he certainly understood the British colonial expansionism, particularly with regard to the mineral wealth of the colonies. He wasn't alone. And though the exact figures are unknown and much is speculation, it seems as many Jewish immigrants supported the Boers as supported the British. Yet Sammy Marx managed to negotiate the difficult transition from loyal burgher to serving the Union of South Africa, and was eventually rewarded by becoming a senator in the first Union Parliament. Gold was what summoned Johannesburg into being, and gold dictated the form the city would take. And gold has shaped its structures, skylines, societies, suburbs, and social life all the way into the present day, even though the gold mines have either been worked out or had to go to unbelievable depths to remain profitable.
Most of the iconic mine dumps are gone, since new methods have allowed the extraction of even more gold from the sands once thought leached dry. If you wish to see any semblance of Johannesburg in its earliest form, you have to go to a recreation in a theme park.
While many of the early Johannesburg buildings have long since disappeared beneath the will of the property developers, a reasonable number of the gracious Victorian and Edwardian mansions still stand, for these were the homes of the landlords, that wonderfully descriptive portmanteau word that describes an entire class of gilded gentry who shaped the fortunes of the city.
Among them, one Jewish name after another still echoes. Barney Bonato had a mansion, though only the gatehouse still stands. So did Sir Lionel Phillips and Alfred Bate and A. Bailey, and of course Sir George Elboo, whose dining room this is, who remained the longest resident landlord in Johannesburg right up until his death. George Elboo and his brother Leopold were as dirt poor as Bonato and his brother when they arrived in South Africa and engineered an equivalent rags to riches ascent, but without any of the showmanship or spectacle. Quietly, almost doggedly, Elboo left behind his early years in a haberdashery shop in Silesia and eventually headed up General Mining, the conglomerate that became Gencor. Born in Berlin, he was one of the tail end of the Anglo-German Jewish immigration to South Africa, arriving shortly before the first wave of Litvaks. On arrival in Cape Town, George found employment in the haberdashery department of Stutterford's, the high-end department store that modelled itself on Harrods in London. However, he left soon after for Kimberley to join his brother. Initially, they sold produce at the market, but within 2 years, they were diamond dealers, their original goal. Later, they began to invest in a few of the mining companies, not all of which proved profitable. Leopold headed for the goldfields of the Eastern Transvaal, but George stayed on in Kimberley. He did visit Johannesburg, but returned happily to Kimberley, declaring somewhat surprisingly his distaste for the wild scramble to make money.
Nevertheless, George and his brother invested in Witwatersrand mining companies, and when he became chairman and managing director of the Meyer and Charlton mine, George was already resident in Johannesburg. His greatest contributions to mining in South Africa were the introduction of newer, safer techniques and technology, as well as his involvement with a more effective Chamber of Mines. He was made a baronet in 1912 for his services to the industry, and though his children were estranged from Judaism and married out of the faith, Albu remained an important contributor to Jewish charities, including the Hebrew High School in Johannesburg. The final example of the three Jewish landlords I've selected as representative of their times in the development of South Africa has often been referred to as the last of the landlords. In fact, he died as recently as 1957 and was an individual who looked forward and not back and managed a wholly successful transition into a modern world.
Ernest Oppenheimer was born in Germany, son of a well-to-do tobacconist, which may explain his lifelong fondness for cigars. It seems that most of his father's family were involved in diamond brokerage to some degree, and young Ernest was apprenticed at the age of 17 to the intimidatingly named Dunkels, Bühler and Company in London. He was clearly a likely lad and impressed his employers enough for them to send him as their buyer to Kimberley, something he was actually angling for.
He became an independent dealer, joined forces with some other likely lads, became an upstanding citizen at the forefront of the Kimberley community, a member of the Griqualand West Hebrew congregation, where his son, Harry Oppenheimer, had his bris, and after a stint as mayor of Kimberley, Ernest succeeded Sir Davis Harris as a member of the Union Parliament.
But all the while, Ernest watched and learned and kept his eye on the biggest player in the diamond fields, Cecil John Rhodes and his De Beers consortium. In partnership with others, Oppenheimer bought control or the output of the few mines that refused to deal with De Beers, most notably after the First World War, the alluvial diamond mines of German Southwest Africa, and after the Union of South Africa, the premier mines of Cullinan, the home of the Cullinan diamond.
With financial backing from J.P. Morgan, Oppenheimer founded Anglo American, still one of the most significant companies in South Africa. As was the signature response of Rhodes's De Beers in the face of competition, Oppenheimer was brought into their fold as a minority shareholder. Through careful and astute trading and the acquisition of shares, sometimes singly, sometimes in quantity, he soon became the majority shareholder, and in 1927, De Beers was essentially his, while Anglo American continued expanding until it too was the dominant presence in South African mining. He converted to Anglicanism when he married his second wife and became Sir Ernest Oppenheimer in 1921. There was a lot of that going round. Sir George Albu, Sir Lionel Phillips, and so on. It was probably the single most concentrated period for such honours to be given to South Africans, and the number of South African Jews who were so honoured indicates the degree to which the upper crust of the community had assimilated.
What, though, of our Jewish Smos, who had carried on peddling his wares in Kimberley and then through the Orange Free State onto the Highveld and the mining camp that would become Johannesburg?
The financiers, the mining magnates, and the industrialists would come along soon enough. But when it was the miners and the small mining service industries that followed them, our Smos was there, peddling the usual necessities that the miners and speculators wanted. And since he'd been around when Kimberley stopped being a collection of tents and huts and became Kimberley, he waited until the dusty paths between the tents and huts of Ferreira's camp became more discernibly a road, and then he opened a shopgilla. As it happened in Kimberley, these shopkas were more specialized. General dealers were more a fixture of smaller dorps and towns. There might be a small eating house or a tavern or a dairy and bakery. And when women began to join their menfolk and the area became more domesticated or acceptable to family life, such items as were needed by families suddenly bloomed in the galvanized iron and brick buildings that were no longer shopkas, but shops with proper signboards and proprietors' names. Of course, there was a teeming market square where things were traded a little more intensely, and it was an area that new Litvak arrivals would recognize easily from their old towns and shtetls in the old country. It may seem almost idyllic, the start of a new town or city built on hopes and possibilities. Yet, any new urban settlement inevitably attracts a seamier side, and Johannesburg was no different. For example, sales of alcohol were forbidden to the already segregated black laborers, but a few bar or tavern owners saw no harm in backdoor sales to them, and among the many taverners were a few Jewish immigrants. Almost immediately, angry letters and editorials in the emerging press denounced the Jews as being responsible for the entire illegal trade. Then, because this was a settlement essentially of men, prostitution and brothels began to appear. More angry letters, more denunciations.
Okay, it's time to talk about the Peruvians, or Peruvniks as they were known in Yiddish. No one knows for sure where this epithet emerged, but its use was ubiquitous in the South African Jewish community up until fairly recently. I can still remember my father dismissing someone as being a Peruvian, by which was meant someone who was uneducated, even illiterate, extremely low class, boorish, and ill-mannered.
Some trace the name to a Polish and Russian union, PRU, or a congregation that existed in Kimberley, and others to an historically inaccurate idea that the old Latin name for Poland was Peruvia. The stories go on, and nobody really knows the truth, but the name was applied to Litvak Jews living around Market Square in early Johannesburg, an area of high density and high poverty. The Jewish community in early Johannesburg certainly had an underworld, but the names involved amount to a handful. Here's one of the most notorious: Joe Silver from the East End of London.
Look at that punim. That's a face only a mother could love. I can hear someone saying Ashanda for the Goyim, yet it's an indication of how quickly the Litvaks were integrating into the society of this mining town, as well as pointing to the disturbing factual rise of a generalized discrimination rearing its head not just in the world of Afrikaner nationalism, but also in the society at large.
And the Smosa continued hawking, and the proprietors of shopkas moved up and started building little empires, branches of the enterprise. It was the coming thing. So one shop begat two, and then came a branch in another town or city, and before long, the chain had spread across the country.
In this instance, these really are household names, because these are the stores that South Africans of all walks of life frequented from an early age. Come with me, let's take a hypothetical drive down any main street of a South African town of your choice.
The original initiating impulse for the local chain stores began in London in the form of J. Moorburger and Son Drapery Clothing, etc. Well, that's what it said on the storefront. One of J. Moorburger's sons was Morris, who was brought to South Africa and soon enough amassed a solid fortune as a shopkeeper. Having the ready cash where the others did not, he financed 3 independent drapery and clothing shops managed by Gus Ackerman, Sam Kirsch, and Leon Siegel. Moorburger came to realize that it made more sense and saved costs if the buying of goods for these shops was done in bulk for the benefit of all 3. The next step was the amalgamation of the 3 shops into one company. Common wisdom has it that the name Ackerman was selected above Siegel and Kirsch because it sounded more neutral, that is, not too Jewish, but Siegel's wife maintained it was because Ackerman was also a popular Afrikaans name. That's the way the first chain store in South Africa came into being. And in a comparatively short space of time, you could find a branch in most towns and cities in the country. Next up, OK Bazaars. Sam Cohen was originally a violinist from London, and Michael Miller was a hairdresser from Lithuania. Both drifted into commerce and retail and became friends and partners when Sam married Michael's sister Dora. They decided to join forces and opened a wholesale business in Bloemfontein, but neither of them liked Bloem very much, and they agreed to relocate the business to Johannesburg. Cohen and Miller decided to go back into a cash retail business and opened OK Bazaars in 1927 on Elof Street. It was such a success that branches opened successively over the next 4 years in all the main centers of the country, with Cohen insisting that the store layout and departmental organization was replicated in each branch. I.W. Schlesinger, one of the most significant entrepreneurial figures of the early 20th century South Africa, was for a short time the chairman when the company went public. But when he attempted to take managing control of OK Bazaars, his erstwhile close friend Sam fought him vigorously to the point where he eventually surrendered his shares.
Richard Sonnenberg, the son of the founder of the next big chain, Woolworths, recalled Sam Cohen's humor and philosophy. He once noticed that Sam sported a handkerchief in his pocket with letters embroidered on the top. He asked what they meant, and Sam told him it was the symbol of a club and asked Sonnenberg if he wished to join it. When Sonnenberg assented, he handed him an identical handkerchief with the same letters along an edge. Pressed to disclose the meaning of the letters, Sam said, "I'll tell you what YCDBSOYA means. You can't do business sitting on your ass." The OK went on to expand and diversify, adding groceries and appliances to its drapery and haberdashery stock. So, ladies and gentlemen, across the hypothetical road from Ackerman's, a branch of the OK Bazaars.
Now here's our Woolworths store, a chain so popular in South Africa that it has an affectionate nickname, and most of the public, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, still talk of going off to Woolies. Max Sonnenberg, an immigrant like nearly everyone else, began his career in his uncle's store in Vryburg, later moving through what was known as British Bechuanaland into Rhodesia.
It was there that he formed his close friendship with Ellie Sussman, who was later to manage the Woolworths stores in the Transvaal before keeping things in the family, and with his son David Sussman becoming a chairman of both Woolworths and Wooltrue.
Sonnenberg relocated to Cape Town permanently and purchased yet another haberdashery and drapers. Whilst in England to meet with some of his suppliers, Sonnenberg lunched with Percy Robert Lewis, then managing director of the Australian Chain Stores Limited, who were the buying office and shippers for Woolworths Limited of Australia. Lewis asked him to open a chain of stores on Woolworths Australia's behalf in South Africa. The first Woolworths store opened in Cape Town in 1931, and by 1934 had branches across the country.
After the war, Max Sonnenberg continued expanding Woolworths, though the core business was still largely clothing.
On a trip to the UK, he took his wife and daughters along for a holiday, and there he met Sir Simon Marks of Marks and Spencer. And the upshot was that a long-standing agreement was signed between Woolies and Marks and Sparks. When Woolies moved into the quality food market in the early 60s, it became the saviour of many a third and fourth generation South African Jewish housewife, commonly known by the affectionate food-related epithet of Kuggles, who just couldn't survive without their weekly Woolies fix doll. Let's consider two more chain stores, and they're Checkers and Pick n Pay. Even though Greatermans carried a grocery range, Norman Herber, who had succeeded his father at the helm of that company, decided on a supermarket chain.
By this stage, Ackermans was a subsidiary of Greatermans, the ranking in their names proving prophetically true, and Raymond Ackerman, son of Gus, had been poached away from Ackermans.
Norman Herber decided that Raymond should be part of the Checkers development, and at this time, shopping centres were just coming into vogue in South Africa.
Herber was very keen on the development, especially if a branch of Checkers could be the anchor tenant.
By the mid-60s, there were more than 80 Checkers stores around the country. Unfortunately, Herber and Ackerman fell out, and Ackerman was asked to resign from the company. Ackerman decided to start his own chain of supermarkets where, unlike the grocery stores of yore, you could enter, pick what you wanted off the shelf, and pay as you exited, hence the name Pick n Pay. Pick n Pay has been in open rivalry with Checkers ever since.
The immigrants were people with enterprise who were highly dissatisfied with where they came from and the prejudice against them. By and large, they were younger people, and they had to find jobs. And where did they find jobs? They found jobs in the little storekeepers that their predecessors had established in the country towns. And this gave them a knowledge of retailing, and this was their background into the country. And the only skill that they knew was retailing. I would guess that a lot of these big retail chains today had their origins in one or other small store, or somebody who came out from Europe, opened a small store, employed other people, and these grew into pretty big operations. Bearing in mind that South Africa at that stage was very much an immigrant society, and there was no competitive advantage for anybody having a single store. And people soon learnt that if you're buying for one store, you can buy for two, and you buy for three, and so on. So those guys who got in first really had a head start, and so you have what you have today.
Yet the concern of these leaders for the welfare of the community was part of their business plan.
They all came from poverty, and when they had the good fortune to be successful, and they saw poverty around them, or people in need around them, it was an automatic reaction when you came from a tough upbringing and you were able to help others. I mean, what do you do with wealth? The biggest pleasure you can have is to see you yourself helping others. The need also came about from the necessity to send money home. So there were a lot of opportunities for people who were successful to make contributions to the community, and they obviously got a lot of satisfaction out of that, and you can see it across South Africa, and indeed certainly across the world. You give a man a fish, he eats it, he has no more. You give a man a fishing rod, he fishes for fish, and he is becoming self-sustaining. And therefore, in my emphasis on where I would like to direct the philanthropy that I have available, I try to put it into an area that is sustainable rather than just edible.
Look into any commercial enterprise in South Africa and you're bound to find a Jewish connection. Clothing, the so-called rag trade. Rex Trueform and SA Clothing were probably the biggest, but there were firms both big and small which could trace their origins to the little Jewish tailors who first set up shop in the Cape Colony. Bertish and Company, Monatic Elba, Whelan Ashheim, Seardle, and others were early forerunners. And of course, the general chain stores had their in-house specialty labels. Included too were the various fashion chain stores such as Foschini's, Truworth's, and Edgar's. But it was in manufacturing that the majority of Jewish names were involved. Of course, they needed textiles to make the clothing, and the Frame group of companies was the dominant provider, with major fabric weaving and spinning mills along with its competitor SA Woolen Mills, which was the first to be established but was later taken over by the Frame group. A similar presence is found in furnishing and home goods. Ellerines and Bears are two giant names, not to mention the heavyweight manufacturing elsewhere of companies such as PG Glass, Cape Gate and Fence, and Max Steel.
It's all becoming a little overwhelming, isn't it? So perhaps now's the time to mention an old anti-Semitic slur that raises its head every time there's a strong display of successful businesses in any number of communities. The Jews control big business worldwide and control it for their personal advantage and that of their immediate ethnic community. In the face of this remarkable tally of Jewish businessmen and women in South Africa, it might seem on the surface that there may be some verity there. However, I haven't mentioned the far larger number of non-Jewish business enterprises that really did dominate the country, or the extremely stiff competition that the Jewish owners of country general dealerships faced from the Afrikaner-owned co-ops that challenged them. By keeping our focus on this one community, their context becomes a little blurred.
In present-day South Africa, a whole new generation of Jewish entrepreneurs has built on the achievements of their predecessors in accordance with the changing nature of global business and the totally reimagined new South Africa of the post-apartheid decades. Most of these young Turks are the product of one or another of the Jewish day schools and the thorough realization of a distinctive South African Jewish community.
The guys that came out from Lithuania into the country little dorps. I'm from Middelburg. I remember my grandfather having a wholesaler and operating as a wholesaler, and my dad operating the garages there. And I mean, the kind of lessons that they taught, and the lessons that we've had the privilege to just, from the first I could listen. I was hearing the stock market on the radio in Middelburg. And my grandfather, whenever the markets were up, he would smoke a cigar. So the smell of a cigar was always a good sign in our house that the markets were up. And that I remember from 5 and 6 years old. And that kind of business in the blood, I think is critical. And coming from Lithuania, I'm a big fan of Lithuania and of the kind of values that I think we learned from our grandparents. And those are values of, real solid values of family, of ethical business. I think it's such an important thing to have learned from that generation. And I think the role of Jews in South Africa has been unbelievable in business and in politics and in so many other areas. It's really, really been phenomenal. And I think it's an important part of the business success of South Africa, because it's about buying and selling ultimately, and about people and how you treat people. To me, it's a very critical thing, is treat people the way that you would want to be treated, is what I learned from my grandfather, basically. And I think that as Jews, that's the lesson, that's the core lesson that I think we can bring to a new South Africa. That ethics is vital, and I think as a Jew, we have a kind of core mission for me as a Jew is we are shining light to the nations. You can do social good and you can do good for business. They don't necessarily contradict each other. You can do good business in a social way. When you go into the field and like a Smos, go back to where some of the small country towns and just go and feel the energy and just get into get onto the street a little bit. Go to Con Hill and go and just come to Victoria Yards and talk to traders, talk to entrepreneurs. There's hope, incredible hope. Despite all the challenges, there's a lot of hope.
I've mentioned before the tension between identification as a South African Jew or a Jewish South African, and it is a topic we'll discuss further. At this point, what we need acknowledge is the existence, nearly 200 years later, of a community that began as self-improving individuals in a foreign place and is now a distinctive part of the greater South African nation, with its own identity and physical presence in bricks and mortar. It is that physical presence that is the topic of our next episode.
One day I looked up and there you were, like a simple question, looking for an answer. Now I am a whale, listening to some inner call, swimming blindly to throw myself upon your shore. What if I don't find you when I have landed? Would you leave me here to die on your shore stranded? Think I know why the dog howls at the moon. I think I know why the dog howls at the moon. I say, Dela, Dela, minangia Dela. day and night, day and night. I've been waiting for you all my life, waiting for redemption. I've been waiting day and night. I burn for you. Sondela, Sondela, Mama Sondela, I burn for you. I've been waiting for you all my life, hoping for a miracle. I've been waiting day and night, day and night. I've been waiting for you all my life, waiting for redemption. I've been waiting day and night. I burn for you, burn for you. 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 I've been thinking about the way I think about my thinking. I have a feeling that our little boat is sinking. I don't know anymore what it is she sees in me. Maybe the promise of the man I used to be. Somewhere long ago we lost our way. Stop the clock and start again. If I could freeze the sun in the sky, I could go back in time. If I could only go back to that day, maybe we'll find our way. King of time. King of time. Hold the line. She'll be mine. We'll be fine. Hausa Shella and Dombi. She remembers things I said long ago. We're trapped in the past, the future won't flow. If I could travel back in time, her heart would never break. Change the past and fix my mistake. We could wake up to a brand new day, whistling our troubles away. If I could speak to the king of time, he could erase and rewind. If I could only go back to that day, maybe we'll find our way. King of time. King of time. Hold the line. She'll be mine. Hausa Shella and Dombi. Putting on my thinking cap, dreaming of my victory lap, looking for the mother lode, hoping my head don't explode. My crazy